Hi guys, welcome back to my channel Lush Foliage. In today's video, we are going to be talking about an extremely easy to grow plant called as the Dieffenbachia. Now, of late, this plant is not much in demand. It is a very underrated plant, probably because there are a lot of new varieties of plants that are coming up in the market and people tend to buy them more, like the monsteras, anthuriums, or the philodendrons. These are more purchased these days rather than these old and easy plants. Now, I prefer to call them as old as gold because these plants initially were in every garden, every gardener, every plant parent used to have at least one variety of Dieffenbachia. Now, there are so many varieties of Dieffenbachia. I am not very sure about the IDs because each and every Dieffenbachia has a unique ID. I'm not even sure the ones that I have, but I have around 4 to 5 of them. One of them you might have already seen, the Dieffenbachia reflector. I've already made a video on it. I will put the link in the description below. You can check it out. So these plants are very easy to grow. They tend to grow really huge. And the unique thing about this plant is as this plant starts to mature, the stump or the stem of this plant tends to get very thick in size. It tends to get very broad and it almost looks like a tree trunk. So with the stump, you can try and understand how old the plant is. Because in my neighborhood as well, there are a lot of people who have kept this plant outdoor and the size of the trunk is really huge, which definitely indicates that the plant is at least 10 to 15 years old. The leaves tend to grow really big and it tends to put out a lot of offsets. So guys, now as I said, this is a very easy to grow plant. If you want to get a plant that is very green in color, that has a lot of variegation, ideally variegated plants are very expensive. But trust me, most of the Dieffenbachias are so cheap that if you go to a local nursery, you might even find them for 40 rupees or 50 rupees. Some of the varieties definitely are very expensive, but most of the common varieties you will get it at a very cheaper rate. Apart from that, if you do not want to buy it from a nursery, it's absolutely okay. You can just ask a cutting from anyone. And that will propagate very well. So guys, let's start with the basic care requirements, which starts with the soil. Now, I tend to use the same soil mix which I use for my other plants. That is a mix of coco peat, garden soil, sand and perlite. Coco peat is there in the soil to just maintain that little bit of moisture because these plants do like a little bit of moisture. Garden soil is to give the basic nutrients for the plant. Sand is to make the soil well draining because they do not like to be sitting in soggy wet soil or wet feet. Otherwise, that could lead to a root rot. Perlite is to aerate the soil. So basically all of these components are going to make the mix well draining, loose, porous and airy. Now I cannot give you the exact proportion because this completely depends from environment to environment. If you are from a dry environment, increase the amount of coco peat. If you are from a very humid environment, try to reduce the amount of coco peat. Basically your soil mix should kind of match according to the environment that you live in. Now talking about watering is just like any other foliage plant. Whenever you see that the upper layer of soil is dry, let's say around 3 to 4 inches of the soil, upper layer of soil is dry, you can go ahead and do a watering. Now guys, you have to water until the water starts passing through the drain hole. Do not do an incomplete watering. And the pot that you have kept this plant in should have a drain hole so that the water does not sit in the pot, because if there is water, if there is soggy wet soil or if there is water staying in the pot, then that can lead to a root rot. So you have to be extremely careful. Now guys, this plant will do very well in a moderate temperature. If the temperatures are very extreme, then you'll have to either get it indoor because this plant can be easily grown indoor as well as outdoor. In a moderate temperature, it is going to do quite well. When I say moderate temperature, anywhere between 15 degrees Celsius up to 34-35 degrees Celsius, it's absolutely okay. Now the humidity is, even though this is a tropical plant, it is not very fussy about humidity. It will do quite well in average humidity as well. You do not need to buy a humidifier. That's why I said it's a very low maintenance plant, does not have a lot of requirements. All you can do is just pot it. If you're growing it outdoor, just keep it in indirect bright light. And if you're growing it indoor, ensure that you're giving it a good amount of indirect bright light. You have to just keep it aside, water whenever the soil is dry, and that's all about it. You don't need to be worried because this plant is very easy to take care. Pest attack, usually this plant does not get affected with pest attack. I haven't seen any mealybugs or any other insects or aphids on this plant. You might occasionally happen to see scale insects. That is only if your other plants are affected, then those scale insects can transfer onto it. But otherwise, this plant is very pest resilient. Now the most important question about the light requirement. Now guys, I would ideally say if you have a very young plant, like my plants over here, they are very small, they are very young. So I wouldn't expose them to direct afternoon sunlight or direct morning sunlight. I usually tend to keep them in indirect bright light. If your plant is very mature, it is a very old plant, of course you can keep it in morning direct sunlight for let's say 2 to 3 hours. But if your plant is very young, it's very small like my plant, then ensure that you keep it in indirect bright light, because if the sun is really strong, it can easily burn the leaves. So you have to ensure that you keep in mind these things. Indoor as well, you can keep it. Ensure that you're not keeping it near the air conditioning vent or a heater, otherwise that will damage the leaves. You can keep it near the window, you can keep it near the door, wherever there is a good amount of indirect bright light. Only the mature plants, let's say if you have a plant for almost 3 years, 4 years or 5 years, then you can give it a good amount of morning sunlight, because that plant will be acclimated. But the new plants or the smaller plants will not be able to handle that strong sunlight. Now guys, talking about, is this plant toxic? Yes, this plant is very toxic, especially if the leaves are ingested or when you tend to do a cutting, and if the sap comes in contact with your skin, and if you have delicate skin, it can irritate your skin. So you have to be extremely careful. That's why a lot of people do not keep this plant indoor, because of the toxicity of this plant. So if you have small kids or if you have pets at home, then ensure that you're keeping this plant away from the reach of them, because if the leaves are ingested, it can be poisonous, it can be toxic. So you have to seek medical help as soon as possible. Even if you're doing any kind of cutting of this plant, ensure that after cutting, whether it's a blade, scissor or knife, ensure you wash it properly before you store it again. Always use gloves whenever you are doing propagation. I will make a propagation video on this very soon. I'm just waiting for a little bit of the painting to be done. The renovation is going to be completed very soon, and I will put up the propagation video. I will show you a couple of methods how you can propagate this plant. It's very, very simple. Now talking about fertilizers, this plant is not a very heavy feeder. It can go without fertilizers for a couple of months. The best thing what you can use is you can use liquid fertilizer, because liquid fertilizers tend to get absorbed by the plant much faster. I tend to use the compost tea, or the liquid that tends to come out from the compost bin. I tend to use that. If you want, you can use a vermicompost, you can use a regular compost, or you can even use a little bit of seaweed, whichever is available with you. So guys, I hope that this video was helpful to you. If it was, please hit the like button. If you're new to my channel, please consider subscribing to it. Until then, take care, stay safe and keep planting.